Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to a very late Tuesday talk show because it's actually Friday. Yeah, I've been writing and scrapping this one quite a bit because it's been a bit difficult to figure out where to start on this because the length of effort that's been put into this sort of world has been absolutely astronomical. Even from before I started playing D&D, it's been something that people have been working on, and I've sort of co-opted it. Currently, I'm writing a D&D campaign that I'm going to be running. It's actually not going to be using the D&D rules, but the core ideas of it and the core sort of setting is based heavily around that sort of thing, because it's been an evolving setting for a long time. But anyway, I find that for this particular instance, what we're getting into is slightly better represented by Shadowrun rules, because this is the farther future of that same sort of setting. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about is maybe how that setting came to be a little bit, and that might help give me a bit of inspiration going forward in figuring out what exactly I want to write for this particular one. So one of my DMs in my particular game group has been running the same campaign setting for about 30-ish years, as far as I know, since like first edition, when he was like a little kid or something like that, and way before I started, way before I've been around, and it's been sort of progressing in kind of chapters in the same sort of thing over and over and over again. To a certain degree, I feel guilty about this sort of thing because it's been a progressive thing that's been working on it so long, and I'm basically a catalyst for tremendous amounts of bullshit happening in these sorts of things. But that's sort of besides the point there. But anyway, he's got this sort of cosmology set up that's specific to his setting. It incorporates sort of ideas taken from a lot of the other ones. It, for example, uses the crystal sphere idea from, I believe that one's Planescape, that uses that one in particular. And it uses all sorts of different mythologies and mythos. He prefers using the real world ones over the fantasy ones. So, for example, the Nordic pantheon is very, very prominent in it. Gods like Odin and Thor and stuff like that are very much an important part of that setting there. I haven't actually seen the Greek deities, which would have been... I'm surprised that we haven't had one there, but I guess the DM's just not as interested in those. But they're kicking around in theory. They just aren't the focal point of many of the games or campaigns. And it's been sort of built upon, and there's sort of heroes that everyone knows about, and there's villains that everybody knows about, and there's sort of events that have shaped the past history, and sort of great deities that were once heroes and stuff like that. So it's a little bit like Faerun in that sort of sense there, where characters like Tensor or Mordekaiser, or not Mordekaiser, Mordecai... Wow, I cannot remember that guy's name. He's that asshole wizard that's basically invincible that turned into all sorts of other weird things that's in Faerun. But all those other sort of characters that have become really high level and have sort of shaped the way the world is, and who are basically deities into their own right, or actually have ascended to deityhood. It's a little bit like that in terms of the world. One of the interesting things about it is that I think I'm the only player in his entire group that has never created a character that has ascended to any sort of godhood, because he likes allowing that for players when they sort of want to. So most players have created something that an adventurer or something like that has become a deity, just because, you know, it adds to the cosmology, it adds to the sort of flavor of the setting and the world and all that other stuff. I think I'm the only person in the entire group that hasn't added to that yet. But in any event, so it's been sort of continual for a very long time. It's currently not being run. My first experience with it, I actually played an elven cleric in this sort of very, very, very undead-focused campaign, very focused on area of effect type attacks and so on and so forth. And I was pretty effective considering that I was fairly early into me playing D&D. I think that was my fourth ever character built. And it worked out pretty okay. I enjoyed playing that one. I came into the tail end of that campaign. But where I have to start talking about how I've influenced the setting majorly is with the character Kale. This is middle-ish into my D&D 3.5, I'd say, playing of that, and it was a kind of interesting character. Now, because this is a DM who's been running for such a long time, and this is such a world that is based around his ideas and what he does, there's a ton of homebrewed stuff in every one of his campaigns, and I don't mind that at all. I'm a huge stickler for rules, but house rules are rules, and if a DM wants to incorporate those into it to make his setting more rich, then I'm fully for that. It's just that you have to be consistent with how those rules are then incorporated into things. But one of the things that he allowed was for players to play an actual fairy from, you know, the old myths, the ones where they're vicious, steal people's children, stuff like that. and stuff like that. So I was actually playing one of the High Shay, Sidhe, and there are these incredibly powerful mythical creatures. And one of the things that, for those of you who know about D&D, know about is the CR and the level adjustment systems. This is a race that had a level adjustment of 4. We started off at level 4, and he allowed me to play a level 0 character that had half a hit die. And I started this campaign with 6 constitution, so I had 1 hit die, or one hit point, sorry, for 2 levels. And that was who Kale was. That was who he was. He was this outcast, self-exiled Shay who had sort of gone off to live amongst the humans because he thought that the fairy politics was too nonsense. And wanted to lead sort of a life amongst simpler, easier to understand peoples, where he didn't have to watch his back all the time and where everything would be a little bit more idyllic in that sort of sense there. Now, obviously, people are still jackasses, but if you were to compare them to the fairies of myth, humans are saints, basically, in terms of not backstabbing you. So that's the sort of environment that he wanted to move to. Now, coincidentally, he was also strength, I think, 5, and sort of like the reasoning I gave behind all this was that despite the fact that he was a blacksmith, he did detail work instead of the actual smithing. So he could do very fine sort of filigrees and detail stuff and all that other stuff that made things very expensive looking, very nice for the aristocrats or whatever. But he himself was like asthmatic from all the smoke that he ingested from when he was there. He had a limp, he had a bad leg, he had this incredibly pale complexion, was always covered in soot and stuff like that, so he just was not a healthy person. But I think he had something like a charisma of 22, and I think he had an intelligence score of 26 at the start of the game, which is what the level adjustment of 4 was paying for, basically. It was the gigantic increase to stats. There was one other thing that was important in the fluff for it that wasn't intended to ever actually be utilized by players, and that is that he had written into the race's description that every 1,000 years they gain a level, regardless of their actual experience points total, and this would be tracked separately of their experience points total. And I kept that in mind because that was going to be very important for me later. I didn't know it was going to be important for me later, but it ended up being fairly important for me later. So the other thing that the DM added to this campaign that was quite important to me was the skill astrology, and this was a sort of knowledge type skill there. It ran off of intelligence, which my character had plenty of, but you could use this to make your spells more powerful, but you had to actually know when to make your spell more powerful. Like, you had to say, I'm going to use this on the 590,000th round tomorrow, and then I'll get a plus 10 bonus to an action at that round. So figuring out when to use these was actually very difficult. But the other 2 tricks to this were it allowed you to increase other people's agricultural checks, and it allowed you to also do very limited divination, which was how you were supposed to be able to figure out when to actually use these bonuses and apply them. So my character took to that like an insane person takes to the psych ward, and that, I was locked in there and was never getting out, basically. I think I ended up having that skill starting at something like a plus 60 or something ridiculous like that throughout the campaign. So what my character was doing fundamentally throughout most of the game was helping farmers by making them much, much more lucrative. And this sort of spiraled into this thing where I was controlling basically all of the agricultural output and all of the fisheries in the entire region, basically. So all the feudal lords around there didn't have control of the farmers, which was kind of an interesting thing. Eventually my character had become so powerful, just magically, that it was impossible for anybody else in the region to even bother thinking about opposing him, so they didn't, which is funny because my character was actually pretty nice to the local nobility and stuff like that. Like, they asked him to do something, he would, and so on and so forth, but eventually they're just like, yeah, no, you just do whatever it is you're gonna do there. And he's like, okay. And eventually there were so many peasants that had flocked him that he had basically started his own sort of nation there. And there's a recurring bit of advice for DMs. If players seek to rule over things, the best way to dissuade them from doing that. So, like, there's horror stories for DMs where they've got, like, this powerful king and he's telling them to do things, and the adventurers are like, we don't want to listen to you, we're going to usurp the king and rule the country. And the best way to dissuade players from doing that is to let them, because then they have to run the kingdom instead of adventuring. It becomes a slog and it's boring and it's terrible. Yeah, I think my DM thought that maybe that would dissuade me from doing this. He did not expect me to come to the next session with an entire written constitution and pie graphs and charts, because that's the sort of psychopath that I am. By contrast, at the same time, actually no, it was several sessions after that, quite a few after. One of my friends had decided that he would also do something similar to this. So he'd form a gigantic trade nation, because that's what he had been sort of off doing in the background while we were doing our adventuring. The differences between us are quite stark in that he had gone off to do that, and he is exactly the sort of person that that advice applies to. He hasn't actually fleshed out anything about this nation in any sort of tangible sense there. He doesn't really have any sort of direction or idea about what they do or what they want or how they function or who's in there or what sort of people they are or what direction their government is. Absolutely none of that. It's just like, well, we want to earn lots and lots of money. And it's like, okay, well, how are you going to earn lots and lots of money? It's like, I don't know. So yeah, he's exactly the sort of person that that advice applies to, whereas I'm the person where that backfires and everyone dies, sort of thing. It's like saying, okay, well, I mean, if you cut the red wire, it'll be fine. Apparently I was one of those ones where the technician knew that was a rule, so he made the red wire the one that causes it to detonate. So yeah, that's the analogy I would like to use there. So anyway, this character essentially garnered this gigantic base of support. And this ended up being something that was quite important to the setting because it was an incredibly stagnant feudal type society, or even clan-based pre-feudal society. And my character wasn't, like, I'm not the sort of jackass player that's going to try and introduce gunpowder into whatever world he's in, even though it doesn't make any sense for that to exist there, or it doesn't actually make sense for people to try and invent it or whatever. What I instead did was just take a look at the core magic rules that were already existent in the particular setting. And just was like, okay, well, one of the interesting things about the economics of D&D is that one of the most valuable things in the game is magic, and like that should be just generically obvious, but there's actually tangible values that can be attached to it, gold piece values that can be attached to magic in D&D. For example, a first level spell slot cast by a first level mage is worth 10 gold pieces. This is actually listed in the books. One of the interesting things is that there's no depreciation of magic as you scale up the amounts that there are, however, because it can be immediately transferred from that into something else that's tangible and different. So if you have a lot of magic, you can turn that into a bunch of plants, and you can use those plants for whatever their value is. So you can't really debase the currency of magic. So I ended up setting up this entire economic system built around using magic as the de facto sort of gold standard for the nation, rather, since you couldn't debase the currency. And if it was getting debased, you could simply purge a bunch of it into useful product instead. So what I ended up doing was reforming the society so that every single person had mandatory education to become a wizard. And that the magic would then get siphoned off to the state and as the taxation, and they got to keep 100% of their income without having to pay any gold piece taxes. Because generally speaking, if you're a wizard in a magic-saturated society, no one is going to buy your spell slots or your spell services. So let the state have it and do something at a national level that's useful with it, because generally speaking, like, you can't make a plant, for example, with a first level spell slot from a first level caster. You need to collect significantly more magic. So what I had to hammer out with the DM was just how much, like, what exactly is magic? Is it something where if you got a whole bunch of it, you could combine it together to do blah, 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 blah. And he had already established, actually, in previous campaigns that if you've got a bunch of spells being put into a spell pool, then you could use that theoretically from a whole bunch of low-level spells to create a higher-level spell, although not necessarily that efficiently. So while this sort of system was being put in place, eventually we got this society where everyone's a wizard and everyone's a caster and everything like that, and doing all sorts of random little magic bits. And their economy is absolutely bullshit. So it's kind of weird. Like, if you take a look at the rules, for example, for someone who say makes chairs for a living or whatever in D&D, and they're exceptionally skilled, they're able to get a 30 total on their check every day, which is to say they've got like plus 20 on their skill, and they take 10, so they get a 30. I think they earn something like, if they're assuming they're making the absolute best possible chair, I think they're making something like 6 silver pieces a day. if they're to do the value there, or they're making like 6 gold pieces a week. Whereas when every single person is a crappy mage, I think they're earning something like, I had done this before, a first level character getting like a single, selling their spell slots, the technical market value of that before the reduction for inefficiencies is something like 25 gold pieces, assuming that they're as dumb as a rock, basically. So you can get actually humongous amounts of free magic from these people for very, very little. And like if they're actually as dumb as a rock and they're a wizard, they've got like that 10 intelligence score where they can't actually cast their magic other than their cantrips. They still have a spell slot technically. They just can't use it. So they could still donate that spell slot to the state, and it would end up being this just gigantic, ridiculous thing. So that's sort of what I ended up creating. And one of the things that I mentioned was that he was using a lot of the rules from things like Planescape, and this included Spelljammers. And this is actually where my friend had a bit of a leg up on me in terms of access to Spelljammers, since I was running from a place that simply didn't have them. Now, there were spells that allowed you to use them on a temporary basis, but yeah, he was the one that actually had a bunch of those. So he was able to sort of go out and do interstellar trade for a very long time. Whereas I was stuck sort of more on planet side and going from plane to plane and doing things the sort of longer way as far as that goes. Eventually that sort of reversed itself. But in any event, the campaign has gone sort of on long enough that it's sort of looking, we're sort of looking at what has then happened since then, and that is that everyone has sort of modernized eventually. So what I'm trying to figure out at this point in time is exactly what other modern states are doing. Which ones rely on technology, which ones rely on magic and stuff like that. Strangely enough, like I'm not running my campaign actually with my friends being in the faction that I'm talking about here. That's simply the world that I've contributed to in that sort of sense, and it still exists within sort of the idea of what my DM wanted for the overall world. With one exception, I did eventually diverge on it because I think my DM is heading towards a point of almost semi-stagnancy in his setting, and that is exactly what he said he was sort of doing. And he's going to sort of have some sort of external event sort of shake things up a little bit. But I don't necessarily actually like the direction he's going, because it actually gives too much credit and too much power to the faction that I did create. When I was talking about sort of the systems and so on and so forth in place, what he eventually concluded was that it was very difficult for any of the factions that he had in place to actually significantly oppose it, and I had said that's probably fine. The problem is that there's no real balance of power in the end of it. Everyone in his campaign world is essentially real world sort of shades of gray and shades of politics and stuff like that, having moved away from the sort of black and white morality of D&D quite a while ago, I'd imagine. Difficult to say. There are still like evil wizards and stuff like that out there that just do evil for the sake of doing evil, but they're on the cosmic scale kind of smaller players than the sort of larger forces at play there. And this meant that there was no really big evil bad guy that was able to oppose the sort of nation that I was creating, and there was not much reason for the good aligned nations to actually just be outright antagonistic or try to break them down or anything like that, especially because they knew that they would be taking horrific losses the entire time. So what he ended up figuring out was that it would gradually sort of shift to everybody sort of adopting the systems that I had put in place for my particular nation. And since I had actually written my guys up as being completely isolationist, sorry, not completely isolationist, but semi-isolationist, he ended up ruling that every single civilization that ended up surviving past a certain point would adopt a similar system. Because it would allow them to make enough income and enough energy. Now, they would be far enough behind that the one I created would still be the one that was in the lead for a very, very long time, or even indefinitely. But basically, everything would become very homogenous looking in the sense of how things ran. So what I've done in mine was I actually split it off, because I actually do believe that there should be a counterbalance to the sort of unambiguously good aligned deities that exist in D&D, and I do think that there should be this sort of fight between good and evil in D&D, and without the shades of gray. So I simply added in a deity that he didn't include, which is Nerul, which is the sort of evil greater deity of death. And this allowed me to sort of create a sort of tripartite balance of power there, where there's Nerul and his various different forces who simply want to grow more powerful. Now, an interesting thing about him being a god of death is that if he kills everyone, he actually disappear because there would be no more death. So long as people are living and dying, he becomes more powerful. So his goal as a deity is to perpetuate wars, not to ever win them. And this makes for an interesting permanent kind of static dynamic where there's lots of potential for things to get disrupted very quickly and then potentially return to a status quo depending on how players interact with it. The other faction would be, of course, the unambiguously good deities, and then there would be my faction as a sort of third party there. One of the things about mine, like I said, I have never created a deity character myself, but the character in the faction I created, Kale, actually became more powerful than the vast majority of deities that were in the setting. There's a few tricks that you can use in D&D that allow you to fight gods without having to become one. So long as you're an epic level spellcaster, it becomes on the table to be able to beat one. And if you're willing to sort of mow through the books enough, you can eventually get through the divine immunities to a certain degree or another. The preferred trick that I used is that I figured out that it's possible, since my character was able to qualify for elven racial feats and classes, to create dead magic deliberately. And this is normally a really dumb thing to do, but there are also tricks that I can use that I did use to cast in dead magic. So what my character ended up being able to do is to strip a god of all their powers and still be able to cast all his magic while doing so. So it's a really, really splat heavy optimization that requires both 3.0 and 3.5 books there, but technically speaking it's rules legal-ish. The only thing it's not legal on is it's not setting consistent, but since the DM was pulling from all those different settings to begin with and the rules from those settings, it ended up being fine. So my character was able to sort of pull that off to actually be able to fight on par with or exceed the abilities of most deities out there. What ended up happening, therefore, was I've got this sort of secular state where deities still exist and all that, but they don't rule everything. Whereas in the other two, there's this sort of balance of power where the forces of good have to actively engage in promoting their followers and promoting everything, whereas the forces of evil are doing the same thing. The evil gods are actively acting and granting things to their followers and so on and so forth. So basically it boils down to people who want to remain neutral in terms of a god war have all flocked to my side to be protected from the god war, whereas everyone faithful to either side is now sort of in a perpetual battle between each other. Where I, for my part, I created a faction that was largely isolationist, so they're staying out of that conflict. So that's sort of the setup that is now existing in the particular setting. Now, all of that being said, I'm going to actually be running my campaign as an evil one, since that's what the general party demand was. They're actually going to be under Nerul's faction as generals of, sergeants under the army of Hextor, one of his most trusted sort of commander deities. So yeah, that's going to be the sort of setup there. I might do another episode talking a bit more into this one for our next Tuesday one, but I think that this is drawn on long enough. But that's the sort of framework and setup for this. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, and I'm hoping that I can sort of add more to the world and make it more interesting and make it more dynamic and so on and so forth. I think that what my DM was actually planning to have happen was that, it reaches a sort of status quo, and that status quo gets absolutely sort of trashed by some sort of external event outside of the sort of crystal spheres or the galaxy or what have you. But I think that it's generally speaking something that's a little bit harder to write for, so that's sort of why I diverged mine. Although maybe he's not even going in that particular direction. There's still lots of dramatic things that can happen within stable states is the thing. So even if everyone is using sort of similar systems and so on and so forth, that doesn't mean that conflict goes away. So I can still see that there's lots of potential for it, but I have heard from him that he's having a bit of difficulty writing in some of the parts to make it so that the players feel as though they're able to contribute to the world, because the world very much is just going to end up plateauing, I feel, which is also unfortunate. It's kind of also why I like the sort of idea of this perpetual conflict, because it means that no state can afford to plateau. The instant they do, then someone who doesn't is going to supersede them and just crush them completely. So everyone's going to constantly be trying to escalate everything to the point of breaking. So I think that that's going to just be a difference in how we sort of run that. But there's a lot of things that I think everyone is added to the setting, but I think that I'm the one who ruined it. So I'm not sure if I should feel proud of that or not, but I definitely feel as though like it was a world worth trying to make my mark on, and it was. I don't really regret anything as far as that goes. Anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.